Amy Lou. Chief Executive Officer for Miller, Canfield, Paddock, and Stone, Michael McGee. President and Chief Executive Officer of the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, Ridgeway White. And to moderate the discussion, U.S. Representative Dan Kildee.
Well, thank you all. Can you hear me all right? All right. So I won't use the mic then. I'm fine. This is my normal voice. Thanks for being here. We've been discussing this challenge of Michigan cities for some time. And in fact, a lot of us in this room in different ways have been working to breathe life into especially our older cities. You know, I come from Flint. I represent Flint and Saginaw and Bay City directly, but I've worked in a lot of Michigan cities, as many of you have. And we have focused a lot of our energy, rightfully, on some of the big challenges that these communities face. The need for capital for new investment, the need for infrastructure, the need to invest in skills. All those big issues are important and are essential to us having vibrant cities that make sure that we can compete in a highly competitive national and global economy. But sometimes it seems that we can't see the forest for the trees, that there are fundamental hurdles that our communities face that need attention as well. And we're here today to address one of those really fundamental questions. So while we're working really hard to ensure that communities have tools around skills and around economic development and growth, I think very often we miss the fact that in the state of Michigan, plainly put, we are underinvesting in those places. It's really tough to imagine how we can be competitive and how we can use the tools that we employ to try to develop the skills and the economy that we need to put people to work and don't fundamentally support basic, essential services, the essential elements of a civil society. And we do that because, unlike what a lot of people think, we don't properly support communities. The funding challenges that our cities face is really serious, and this panel is going to explore this to an extent. Here's the real trouble, I think, the real challenge. We have been talking about this, and many of us working on this challenge, until the lights go out. I look better this way, so I don't really mind. We've been talking about this for a long time. And while there are a lot of really big questions that we have to answer about how we fund cities, there are some low-hanging fruit. There are some real solutions that are not that complicated. We can't compete if cities can't provide the basic fundamentals, the basic essential services. And I think we get caught in kind of a chicken and egg question. Can we attract new investment or encourage existing businesses to invest if they can't count on parks that are maintained and mowed, infrastructure that's managed well, adequate police and fire services? The basic functions of a community are the fundamental underpinning of everything else we do. So in a lot of ways, because of the decisions that have been made in the past, we've had a lot of unintended consequences, and it makes it really difficult for us to compete. Why is it that this is a state that is not growing? I guess the question is, are our cities struggling because our state is not growing, or is our state not growing because our cities are struggling? Cities are where innovation occurs, where entrepreneurship is rooted. We all know cities are important. They are really the vital driver of innovation and entrepreneurship. But it can't work. It won't work unless we have the essential underpinnings. And how do we do that when, in the last decade, Michigan communities have lost $8.6 billion in direct support that we used to be able to rely on is a part of the sort of the three-legged stool of municipal finance. The state support, that's gone. And a taxation system that makes it difficult for communities to have any flexibility to determine for themselves how they want to raise revenues, and even further, a property tax system that holds down our ability to adequately draw revenue from local sources because of an unanticipated and somewhat arcane process of allowing the value of property and taxable value to go down as fast as the market will take it, but only recover at the rate of the consumer price index. These are like really simple technical questions that we ought not ignore, that we have to be able to solve, and this is what the panel is here to address. We've got a great panel. They've been introduced. So I think we'll just start right off with somebody that I should have thanked from the outset, not just for underwriting this particular session, but for all the great work that the Mott Foundation has done. Ridgeway White, the president of the Mott Foundation. So Ridgeway, take it away.
Congressman, thank you and appreciate you being a champion of this initiative because it's really important. You know, $8.6 billion has been diverted from cities and communities since 2002. For Flint, that means over $100 million. For Detroit, that's $1.4 billion during the same time period. And for Grand Rapids, that's $128 million, just to give some examples. So as the Congressman said, we really want to think about what it takes to have Michigan thrive, to have communities thrive, and to attract talent, because that's what the future is. And so I might describe a city. And this city has a lot of the great resources. We have over 20,000 college students, major universities, including a regional campus of the University of Michigan, Kettering University, Mott Community College, MSU's Masters of Public Health. We have the second largest art museum in Michigan, top 25 farmers market, top 10 largest school of performing arts, top 25 farmers market in the country. And yet, Flint has water that you haven't been able to drink for over 5 years. It has crime that's very challenging. It has a police force that's dwindled in size over a period of time. And it's missing that glue that it creates a place that's a place where people choose to live. And that glue is really a well-functioning municipal government, a city government. And it's not because it's been poor management. We've had 5 or 6 financial managers. You know, even Albert Einstein can't figure out how to pay for a police officer that costs $100,000 worth of dollars. And so we do need to, the time is here, to take action on revenue sharing, to take action on all the things that the Congressman talked about. The revenue sharing, the Prop A, giving local municipalities the ability to take action on their own. All the things you see in your card here that the Michigan Municipal League has put together are really spectacular pieces of information. So I encourage you to take a look at that, and I encourage you to leave today. You know, this is our 3rd time here doing this. So it's time for action, and we need to do something with this. The business community needs to come together, make it a priority, and I hope that you do.
Well, we're going to get deeper into conversation as we go, but right now I'd like to turn to Amy Lou from Brookings. I've worked with Amy for about 20 years, I guess.
A long time.
A big part of the work that Amy Hovey and I, who was with Mott Foundation, around land banks and urban regeneration, was started with a conversation that we had at Brookings just about 20 years ago.
Yep.
Amy.
And Genesee County continues to be a model for a lot of communities when it comes to land banking and thinking about the future of communities. So my job right now is to build on the remarks that Congressman Kildee and Ridgeway just set up for us and talk about why Michigan really needs its cities if it hopes to be part of the modern economy. So, oh, this is not the, oh. This is a different slide presentation. We'll start with this one. So what I want to reinforce is the fact that cities are the backbone of the state economy, and it's the backbone of the global economy. And And cities are even more important today because the modern knowledge economy is really dependent on innovative industries, entrepreneurs, skilled workers who really want to be part of vibrant, walkable, high quality of life places. And so despite how important cities are to the future economy and to the state, the municipalities in this state rank dead last in the amount of revenue it has been able to generate to cover basic services and address other challenges that matter to the modern economy. So this is a bar chart put together by the Michigan Municipal League based on census data, and between 2002 and 2016, what you find is the municipalities in this state rank dead last compared to peers in other states in the amount of revenue it can generate, or it has generated from taxes, from fees, and the state revenue sharing that has declined dramatically over the last couple of years. That inability to put public investment in their communities makes it really hard then for cities to attract private capital. And since we did use a different set of slides here, I apologize. What I wanted to do was focus on this, is that the next couple slides really talk about why the fate of the state and its cities are inextricably linked. So I think you all know, if you see this chart, Michigan's jobs recovery has obviously picked up in the last 10 years or 15 years, and particularly since the recession. But the state still has less jobs today than it did in 2001. Meanwhile, that performance dramatically lags the nation as a whole, which has seen exponential job growth since the recession. That story is in part a reflection of what's happening in its cities. If you take a look at the blue bars, ever since the recession, and particularly powered by the digital growth in digital economies, our large metropolitan areas and mid-sized metropolitan areas in the United States have taken off. They are now leading the nation's economic growth and engines. But in Michigan, they too lag their peers in the states. And what you see is places like Detroit, Flint, Ann Arbor, Grand Rapids, even though they have recovered since the recession, they dramatically lag other large cities in the United States, which further undermine the performance of the state when it comes to the economy. And then secondly, I want to talk about people. Do we not have the right slides? Okay, well, there was one more slide I was going to show you, and it was on population growth. And what you saw is in the state line on population growth is that, as you all know, in the last 10 years, Michigan has about, has fewer population today than it did in 2001. And the population loss in the state is in part a reflection of the population loss in its cities. Cities are the magnet for retaining and attracting the talent we need to power our economy. And our 6 largest urban counties since 2001 have together lost 180,000 residents in the last 15 years. And that loss of talent is also a loss of income that can then be consumer spending that gets fueled in our local economies, that can show up in our taxable tax base, and again, get regenerated in our local economy. So the inability for our cities to retain people also hurts the state economy. So overall, when you look at these three trend lines, is that it's very imperative for the state to invest in it, make cities a priority if it is going to compete in the modern era. And we can talk more about solutions in a moment.
Mike.
Thanks, Congressman. While I was listening to Amy talk, I thought of the game show Jeopardy, and she gave the answer, and the answer is talent. And the question is, why would a business like us particularly care about any of this? And the answer is because we care a lot about talent. I represent a company that's been an employer in Michigan for a long, long time, since before the Grant Hotel was around that long. And we're basically in the knowledge business. That's what a law firm is. And in that sense, We're not any different than a CPA firm or financial consultants or software engineers, people that deal in ideas. And in this economy, as we all know, and certainly the business people in the room know, it's all about having the right talent for your business to be able to thrive. The fastest way that our law firm goes out of business is that if I don't hire really smart people on a continuing basis. And so we focus on that, and it's very important. Many of you will remember Walter Wriston once made the famous statement that capital goes where capital is welcome, and it stays where it's treated well. I substitute today talent for that. Talent goes where it's welcome. Talent stays where it's treated well. And part of the way in which you treat talent well is you locate in a place that has what we used to call good quality of life, has the kind of services, has the walkability, has the sense of place that makes a city very, very attractive. And this is important for us in part because we're competing really not so much with municipalities within Michigan, but we're competing for smart talent with cities around the country, certainly around the region. And I don't mean just Chicago. We all know about Chicago as an attractor of talent. But in our world, we're competing with Minneapolis. We're competing with Cincinnati. We're competing with Louisville, and dare I say, Columbus. So, this is a very real concern because young, smart people, as you all know, are extremely mobile. And part of what brings us to this program is, as the congressman detailed a moment ago, we have a municipal finance model that was essentially invented about 1965. It's gone through sort of a number of changes over the last 55 years. But as a matter of policy, the driver for much of that system has been with a simple objective: constrain local government flexibility and constrain local government revenues. And guess what? That policy has been extraordinarily effective. When we get together, and this has not been a Democrat, Republican sort of an issue over the last 55 years. It's been both administrations, it's been both parties. When, as a state, we get together and we suggest we want a policy, we're pretty good at putting it in place. So our point in this is to suggest to business people, it really is time, it's past time to change the policy. The good economy has given us a little bit of runway to work on it, but that's not going to last forever. So we've got work to do.
I might add we should change it before the next recession comes because we can't survive the property tax again.
Agreed.
Well, from what I hear, at least from the guy that I work with in Washington, there's not going to be a next recession. Look, sorry, that's all I'm going to say about that. I also probably should have announced, this is newsworthy. I'm the one who's not running for president.
Oh, darn.
I want to encourage you. I have a couple of questions that I want to pose to the panel, but we really want to get your input and try to touch on some of these issues, reminding you that the focus really is around this fundamental question. We can have a lot of tools that support growth in communities, but if we don't have fundamentally sound cities that have the ability to provide basic public services, it's really hard to imagine how all the other tools work. When we were working on developing land banks around the state, we always ran into this problem of being able to find ways to breathe life into particular properties, but still not having the capability to deliver essential public services to those places. The loss of revenue sharing, the tax structure in Michigan has to be addressed. I want you to note that there are blue cards on the table, and I'm not sure how they'll be turned in. Okay, we've got folks that will be circulating. If you have a question that you want to put to the panel or to a specific member of the panel, please write that down, turn them in just a few minutes. We're going to get to that. Let me start with Ridgeway. And we're not really going to focus on our mutual hometown of Flint, but I do want to ask one specific question. The foundation has been really vital to Flint's recovery from its current woes. I'm curious if you might mention how this issue connects to Mott's overall mission, but particularly its focus on Mott's hometown. in two ways. One, if the support that Mott is able to provide, thankfully, to prop up the essential services that the city otherwise would not be able to provide, if that were not a challenge, where do you think Mott would be able to focus its resources relative to Flint? And then I guess I'd also ask you if you'd sort of paint a picture, given the last decade or so, of what our mutual hometown would look like and what it would be dealing with now if it were not for the fact that revenue sharing had been cut and that essential revenue was not available and the tax structure was such that it limits the ability of the city to raise revenue that it chooses to raise. If you could touch on those issues, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the key things I'd focus on is innovation. And essentially that's one of the pieces that we fund across the globe. So we created a 21st century model of community education through the after-school program with the federal government. It reaches 10 million children across the country. We've got a new initiative with child savings accounts where we've launched in San Francisco. Every single child in San Francisco gets a child savings account, college savings account. And, you know, we do that in Flint, but it's hampered a little bit. So we're doing both the basic services and trying to do innovation. And if we can divert all of our dollars, not divert, if we could channel or focus all of our dollars in innovation, doing the extra things to make the police force just that much better, to make, you know, all of the colleges and universities just that much better versus, you know, supporting, you know, market rates on housing or different, you know, economic development tools. We could do business attraction. So I think there's more that we could do as the answer and more we can do to add service versus just basic service. So I think that's a key thing. I'm painting the picture. I mean, Flint's a fantastic place with a lot of great people with amazing institutions, and I think that if we had a well-functioning, well-funded municipal government, that the glue would all come together, and it'd be a top place for people to live again.
I mean, I think the thing that frustrates a lot of folks is that it felt like we had really begun to see some energy. It's still there. It's a great community. But the water crisis, which was really a result of the financial crisis, which was really a result of the defunding of cities and other things, we wouldn't be in the place we're in right now. This slide, Amy, that is up right now, I don't think most people, at least I can speak for myself, would expect to see that Michigan is dead last in revenues to our local communities. I think, in fact, there's, I think, a conventional thinking that that's not the problem, that it's not the lack of revenue to cities, but as Ridgeway said at the outset, that it's somehow the lack of good management or poor planning. It's really hard to manage or plan your way out of a circumstance where you just don't have enough money to mow the parks, maintain the streets, and keep the police and firefighters in place, even when you're having you know, increased legacy costs as a result of the population loss that is a result very often of this problem. So we have a real challenge. But Amy, you have a perspective, a national perspective on this. And I guess I wonder if you just might comment on, well, what are other states doing?
Sure.
What makes Michigan different in this sense? Why are we so far behind?
So, first of all, I think what this bar chart shows is the amount of constraint on municipal governments. The inability to raise revenue because of state constraints or lack of state revenue sharing. And because of the constraints, they can't generate enough revenue to provide basic services. For all the work that I've done about economic development and all the work we've done about the importance of cities to solve a lot of our domestic and economic and social challenges today, the one thing that we've always said is cities at the most fundamentally have to provide the basics of basic services that undergird economic and market certainty for people, for families, for businesses. Then from that, you can partner around job creation, skills development, and other things. If you can't provide these basic services, it's a real problem. In other states, you know, localities are certainly creatures of the state, but other states do provide more flexibility for jurisdictions to raise revenue. So one example is the red state of Alabama. Alabama is the most generous in its policies towards its municipalities. It provides all of its municipalities multiple ways to raise revenue. It doesn't limit the amount of tax assessments or increases on their property or other kind of existing tax capacities, and it has generous revenue sharing with its municipalities. That's probably the most generous example. The others are really interesting because states sometimes are themselves fiscally constrained. So I have another example, Illinois. Everyone knows how the fiscal challenges the state of Illinois has had, almost to a point of declaring bankruptcy. And they can't do revenue sharing with their jurisdictions because of the state fiscal picture. But what they did was say, okay, we can't give you revenue sharing, but we will give you in exchange home rule. So we can't give you more dollars, but we're going to give you the tools and flexibility for you to raise whatever revenue you need to address issues locally. So less money, greater flexibility. The flip side is there are some states who recognize it's too politically hard to change statutory limitations on restrictions for jurisdictions to raise revenue. So they do have limits, the same kind of limits you have here in Michigan. But then they say, you know what? We will, though, in exchange, give you generous revenue sharing. This is places like Wisconsin, which is next door, Massachusetts, state of Nevada. Huge restrictions on local jurisdictions raise revenue, but generous revenue sharing in exchange for that. So there are models for better state and local compacts that Michigan ought to try to aspire to.
And the amazing thing, you look at a poll, 89% of people polled and say they'd rather see money spent at the local level than the state level.
That's correct. There's greater trust at the local level and greater trust to raise revenue locally.
Good question. I mean, one of the things that I think I want to maybe have Mike respond to is I think sometimes we get the impression that within the state of Michigan, communities are competing with one another for the growth and development that is sort of knocking on our door. And that this discussion that we're having right now has more to do with whether or not these communities, these especially older cities, are going to be able to compete for that sort of investment, whether it's current investment that could grow or new investment that would come in from elsewhere, or just entrepreneurship that's going to occur. So the question is, are we competing across communities within the state, or are we competing with people around the country? Because if we don't, I think, come to the conclusion that our competition is not between the city and the suburb, but the city here and the city of North Carolina, where there's a real interest in that urban environment, it seems to me we're going to miss a lot. And maybe that explains not just this chart, but the chart that shows lack of growth, lack of population growth. One state in the last census that had net population loss. Maybe comment on what our competition is.
I think that's exactly the right way to look at it. I don't want to take away attention from this slide immediately, because I do think in a way this tells the story in a way that is very easy to understand, so everybody can take a picture and then tweet it if you don't mind. But from our standpoint, as an employer, that's exactly how we have to look at it, because the places where we are losing people, candidly, are almost always outside of the state. Now, I will say that we don't have very much trouble recruiting people to Grand Rapids, because Grand Rapids has that kind of urban and cultural environment that younger people are attracted to. And we all know, and we're all joyful about the work the city of Detroit and its partners have done to restore the city to a very great extent. And where we see that on a day-to-day basis is the folks who handle our recruiting and our hiring see more interest from different parts of the country, more resumes, you know, that sort of thing. So there's certainly, at least anecdotally, there's a connection here between the performance of the city and our ability to attract talent. But as I said earlier, I'm really more worried about what's going on in Cincinnati and Columbus and Louisville, because those are places that are very attractive. They're urban areas that are very well managed and have plenty of amenities, and the people that we're trying to hire like those places. So we need to think of them as our competition because they certainly think of us as somebody they can cherry pick from, no question about that. So I think that's the right way to look at it.
You know, I think this session obviously is focusing on this one aspect. Now, I just want to open it up in a minute to your questions, but I just want to drive home this one particular point. We have essentially balanced our state budget in some ways by unbalancing the budgets of the communities that comprise the state. As if they're two different places, as if it's two different sets of landscape. This is a state made up of communities. Our potential to grow is completely dependent on the strength of those places. So the idea that we look at this essentially through a balance sheet lens, where the real focus is how do we get to the black in the balance sheet of the state government, and not how the investments in our places actually drive growth and essentially attract new investment, is I think where we're missing something, especially when the solution that cities are facing, the set of solutions available to cities that are struggling to balance the budget, is not access to more resources, not access to new investment, not even access to additional tools to attract investment, but quite the opposite. Additional reductions in essential services, additional reductions in those essential elements of a civil society. So the revenue sharing piece is really big because that was a direct decision that was intended to help the state get through its struggle and balanced its books by unbalancing the books of a lot of cities and changing the landscape in those places, reducing those services. But another aspect of this, and Mike, I'm going to throw this to you, that very few people understand, is the fix that's just sitting right there ready for us. Ridgeway, you mentioned it as well. And it's the result of the tax law changes in 1994 that were intended to cap the growth of the taxable value of property in order to keep people from being taxed out of their properties. Like when their value grows fast, we wanted to make sure that the taxable value of a piece of property would only grow at the rate of the consumer price index. But can you just explain quickly what the unintended consequence of that policy ended up being as we went through the financial crisis?
I'll try. I think the main thought is that our tax structure was really conceived of at a time when there was plenty of growth in Michigan. And so the problem that the tax structure is intended to address is the problem of runaway taxes, because growth is going up so much that we need to put a cap on that. Well, we learned in the great credit crash that values can in fact go down, and of course they have gone down, or they did go down, very, very dramatically, 20, 30% in various places. And so the limitations that had been put on back in the day under our current system, the limitations which were intended to operate as a brake on increased revenue growth, when values started to bounce back after the Great Recession, those features of our tax system that were intended to act as a brake, in fact, did do that and constrain the revenue growth to basically rate of inflation, which hasn't been, a whole lot. And so that's why you see both this chart and Amy's chart about the lagging of Michigan cities in recovery. And I do want to come back to something that Ridgeway said, which I think is really important, and we've sort of forgotten this. First of all, I'll say everybody in this room should be quite proud as Michiganders that for the most part, our local government system is very well managed. It's run by people who are very passionate about excellence. They go to school, they get their master's in public administration. They're good people trying to make do with the resources that they have. But Ridgeway said earlier, we can't wait for the next recession. If you remember, at the time of the credit crash, the Department of Treasury in our state had a list of communities that were sort of on the watch list for sort of fiscal hurt. There were a lot of places on that list, a lot of places on that list. Now, things are better. Cities are reasonably well managed. We've been able to recover a little bit. But if the R word, we won't say the R word, if the R word does occur,
I have a different definition of what the R word means, but
We'll be right back to where we were in 2008, and Treasury will have one of those long lists of people that we'll have to worry about, and we'll fall further behind, our competitors in Charlotte and Minneapolis and every other place. So we need to use the time, I would say.
so a
I think
question.
one of the things, I mean, you think about managing a business. You manage through tough times, but your profits rebounded, right? And you were able to take advantage of that. Well, municipalities couldn't do the same thing. Their revenues went down. They only went back up like this
Because they're capped.
because they're capped.
It's actually, I hadn't heard it framed in quite that way, but it is a really good way to understand what the effect of that tax policy has been on locally generated property taxes. You can lose 20% in 2 years, 20% of your value, which is 20% of your revenue, 20% of your sales if you're in a business. But even if you get 20% of that back, you can only collect 1.9% or whatever the CPI is delivering to you. It has the effect of ratcheting down what local governments can collect. So just think about the combination of factors. The loss of revenue sharing, $8.6 billion to communities. The loss of taxable value that can't be recovered because of the unintended effect of a well-intended law that was expected to keep people from being taxed out of their property, but didn't anticipate dramatic loss of property values as a result of a crisis. And then, further, a limitation that does not allow local governments themselves to make the hard choices to raise revenues in other ways. And we did have a question come in, Amy, maybe you might address this, about what other states do, what other local options are available. We talked a little bit before the session about income taxes. We can't even, without pretty dramatic change in both state and local policy, increase the amount of revenue coming in through income taxes to offset this. Can you talk maybe about what some other states have been allowing their municipal governments to do in order to offset those losses?
Yeah, and I want to step back even further, if I may, and talk about that R thing.
Oh, yes.
Maybe the R thing that you were thinking of.
No,
Which is something we talked about prior to this session, which is there's always this sense that the state legislatures are anti-urban, and that this urban-rural divide and the state legislature across states make it really hard to create policies that support our urban areas. What I want to say is in the last 8 years, what I've seen is, yes, some preemption, but a lot of state legislators and governors coming to the realization that they have to partner with their cities and their regions if they're going to compete in the modern era. And that is where their residents are, and that's where their businesses are, and if they are not responsive to those communities, they're doing a disservice to the state. So, Governor Haslam led with a super GOP-controlled state legislature. When he advanced a goal to raise post-secondary attainment goals for the state, he essentially said, I have a statewide goal. I'm giving every single region flexible dollars on how they're going to help achieve statewide goals. It's a recognition that the state can't achieve its objectives without its cities and municipalities as partners, right? That is the stance we need in this state. Governor Sandoval is a former Republican governor of Nevada. He knew that in order for them to modernize with Tesla and other things, as each of their 3 major regions and cities had to be at the forefront of economic growth. And he gave each of those regions flexible regional economic growth dollars for growth and innovation and adaptation, And recently in Virginia, a businessman, a CEO of a major company in one of the most hard-hit communities. Everything one thinks of Virginia as Northern Virginia, and they just won Amazon HQ2. But the rest of the state is Appalachia, a lot of struggling mid-sized cities, a lot of poverty, and we're still in the South. Most of the cities in the state are not that strong. And so this CEO of a major company in a struggling community organized business leaders to work with the Republican Senate and the House to advance a multi-municipal collaboration initiative around economic growth and adaptation. That he didn't want just to focus on jurisdictions competing against one another for economic growth. He wanted the state to put resources to municipalities, to university presidents, to business partners and civic partners with their mayors to work together on some transformational initiatives. And they got that done through the legislature, and the governor ended up signing it. I think it's possible. What I don't want to hear in this community is excuses that the politics won't allow it. In fact, it's almost the economic imperative for the state, if you want to see your state revenues grow, to partner. You know, it's a bipartisan issue. And so that's what I hope you all walk away from it. There's some specific solutions that Dan and Ridgeway, Mike have been talking about, but it's about the posture of the state. This is a bipartisan possibility. We're seeing in other states, and if you don't do it, those other states are going to surpass this one as a result.
Yeah, there is, I mean, I do get a sense sometimes that many cities are viewed as a problem to manage, you know, and not so much as an opportunity that we ought to be able to use to spur our growth, and that the growth is going to happen one way or another, and we have to manage these places that have a great history but not so much a great future. Unfortunately, well, that's just not the reality. What we know is that regions that grow, regions that are innovative, regions that continue to reinvent themselves have really highly productive, highly viable communities. And it's hard to imagine how we do that when the real question that most cities are trying to face is how do you keep the firefighters in place? How do you keep the parks mowed and maintained? Mike, there's a question that came in. I'm into your questions now, so if you have more, please submit them. What's your sense on how we get the business community engaged on this subject?
More programs like this. I do think that there's a natural tendency. When you are running a business, obviously your priority has to be to focus on the immediate needs of that business and so forth. I do think that that there is a desire on the part of business leaders to make positive change. I think we do, frankly, need more conversations around the state, just exactly like this one, which tend to drill down, at least a little bit more on things like the slides that we have up and some of the other alternatives that we've been talking about. But I think the business community itself needs to take a more active leadership role and to say, hey, this is important to us for the talent reasons, for the thriving possibility of our businesses. We have to be a little bit more activist, I think, than we have been traditionally.
Another question that came in has to do with, I mean, this is obviously a complicated set of issues, but what, sort of playing off that, maybe Amy, you could address it. Is there an appetite or is there a possibility of a different private sector role in all of this? There's obviously a lot of conversation about how public-private partnerships might be utilized. It's hard to ignore the fundamental problem of underfunded cities, but could maybe you touch on what other communities are doing to engage the private sector and not leave it just to be a government alone solution?
Well, a couple things. I mean, I was actually thinking about how the business leaders always are really strong civic leaders in their communities, and they often lead the public-private collaborations and are at a voice at the state level. So in Indy, the private sector, run through their chamber or CEO groups, have been co-investing in public schools because they know that their competitiveness in central Indiana is going to be the health of the public schools, and they actually have raised funds to help their public school system modernize. And so that is a public-private partnership and a fundamental public service. It's not just the CEO saying we're going to adopt a school or we're going to host some interns. It's literally we're going to invest in K-12 reform ourselves and be a partner in that change. I also think that what's so interesting is there are CEOs like I'm thinking of Kansas City that have been very frustrated with the state being almost antagonistic to its local leaders. And they have been pushing for the governors to work together in support of local ambitions, to not undermine their cities, and they've been very vocal about helping Kansas City have its own vision irrespective of the state. So CEOs actually exercise a lot of influence and muscle that affect policies or political leadership that help our communities. And I'm sure a lot of people in the room, have that platform too.
Congressman, let me ask you a question. A lot of times, federal government, when there's a couple $1 trillion infrastructure package that comes along, a lot of times federal money comes with a local match requirement.
Yeah.
Do you think that based on our revenue sharing, are we going to lose out on the percentage share of revenue sharing if a large infrastructure package or other things, or have we been?
Yeah, this is a question that I've been struggling with.
That's a softball.
Yeah, it is. Ball on the tee. We, sooner or later in Washington, we're gonna get the will to do something on infrastructure. One thing about the infrastructure question, unlike some of the issues that sort of come and go, if we don't do it, it's not like it just gets better on its own. And the other thing is, if we don't do it, that doesn't mean local governments or state governments are going to be able to generate the revenue. There's some issues that are just so big that they have to be taken on a national scale. But Ridgeway's question is an important one, because I think it's entirely possible, something that we want to avoid, by the way, that because of the problem that we've laid out, because there are so many communities, a whole subset of American cities that are just really operating on very razor-thin margins, barely providing, or maybe not providing, essential basic services. If we went big and spent, say, $2 trillion on the whole range of infrastructure investments that are long overdue in this country, on the conventional approach, it would require an 80% match. First of all, it would require being able to conceptualize what an infrastructure investment strategy for a community might look like. The communities we're talking about have had to focus so much attention and energy on just barely meeting the basic needs that you don't see the kind of robust investment even in planning that would be required for this. Set that aside for a minute. Not only do they not have the revenue to provide what normally would be a 20% match, when it comes to, say, drinking water, for example, most often the way the federal government engages on this is with low-cost loans. You have people in communities across the state, and Flint is a very good example, paying the highest rates in the country for a system that does not really sort of match our expectations. And the idea that putting more capital out there and require local governments to come up with a match is sort of outrageous. So the piece I'm working on relative to all this is to make sure that we have a unique set of solutions around infrastructure for the most distressed places that would allow for the re-engineering of existing public infrastructure so that it more accurately sort of matches the true population in those communities. One of the problems we have is we have infrastructure that's overbuilt for the real population we have. It makes it more expensive to operate.
So maybe as part of your role as a congressman, a U.S. congressman, is that if there's an infrastructure bill that passes, is that state and local eligibility for any resources are contingent upon states giving localities greater fiscal capacity. And so this is, I want to build on this point because this is really important. The future is increasingly being devolved to state and localities to respond to every economic and social challenge of today, including infrastructure. And it is increasingly incumbent upon cities to raise revenue to match private capital to then pay for a whole slew of things in our communities. And in fact, there's a real movement right now for this to happen bottom up, because there is no one-size-fits-all solution, and every single city and metropolitan area should be able to raise advanced policies that fit their own conditions. All of that vision is contingent upon municipalities having the flexibility to raise revenue, to match private resources. That is why it's actually great for the states to say, okay, if this is the new era, we ought to give our municipalities the flexibility to step up and match private capital. It is a win-win. And so anyway, this is just building off on why this is important. And Brookings actually put out a paper last year on the fiscal capacity of cities because of this new reality. We're seeing this everywhere. Federal government, states cutting funds because they believe cities can step up and take care of it. And so if we really believe this is a city era, let's give them the tools, the flexibilities to step up and away versus constrain them.
So one of the questions that came in, and I think it's important to raise it. I just want to contextualize this. I think the data is really clear that in this state, we simply have fallen far short of what we need to do to support functional cities, functional local communities. We've underfunded them. And I would challenge anyone to look at the data and come to another conclusion. But there are questions that come in about the way local government is structured. And I know, Amy, you've mentioned this, maybe Mike or Ridgeway might want to weigh in. Realizing that it doesn't solve the problem by itself, but it might be a part of a solution, what kind of restructuring do you think makes sense for us to pursue in this state, and how do we incentivize that? You got a card there?
I got a card. It says, let's see, $600 million this year in revenue proposed to be diverted. We want to change that. Ensure the property tax system can track the economy. That makes sense. And more local funding options. We talked about that. And, sort of government sharing.
Right.
Encouraging local governments to share. So those are good little cards here.
I mean, I wonder if that is a part of the solution. Again, I want to emphasize, it doesn't replace the need to make sure that we can fund essential public services, but that doesn't mean we can't organize them in a more efficient fashion.
This all comes back to how states need to give municipalities more flexibility. So what we're seeing in most states like Michigan is huge, high government fragmentation. Lots of little box jurisdictions, townships, counties, each operating their own level of services. And whether there's a way to gain some savings by sharing municipal services, city, county sharing services, multiple jurisdictions coming together to offer fire, police, ambulance, emergency services, or others, or water, and so on, even economic development services. In order to do that, there's also state limitations to that. And so what we're seeing in a place like New Jersey is the state legislature removed all the regulatory barriers that will allow jurisdictions to join up on shared services, creating savings. And then New York actually in 2017 put forward a program that gave municipalities interested in service sharing agreements, gave them grants to evaluate how that is done, to get consultants to help them do it, so that it ends up being a revision or reform that helps taxpayers. All of those great ideas require technical assistance. And so for the state to give jurisdictions the resources to do that is also very powerful. That's another way that states can partner with communities to resolve a lot of these cost issues.
We're going to wrap here in a minute, so I just want to ask the panel to respond to this. We have experienced now, in a fairly uneven fashion, but still, we have to acknowledge the reality, 100 straight months of private sector job growth nationally. Unemployment hovering around 3.6%, something like that. Workforce participation generally pretty good. And we have communities that are barely holding on, one step out of Chapter 9 bankruptcy. During one of the longest periods of extended economic growth in recent history. The R word, in this case recession, what happens to these communities? Mike, maybe you could just paint a picture, absent us addressing this challenge, figuring out a way to breathe life and more fundamental fiscal support into these communities. What does the next recession look like for the communities that are operating on really thin margins?
In my opinion, we've already seen that show. It's going to look an awful lot like, starting in about 2007 or so, as Treasury started to put the communities on their sort of fiscal watch list. So it would be, and then, following that, there was a rush to try to reallocate resources and provide help and all of that. But I would argue that's not a very efficient way to, address the problem. Better off to try to use this time, as Ridgeway said earlier, before we get to the next recession, to try to make some of these systemic changes. And I thought what Amy said was very interesting, and I think a very powerful point as it relates to states, in our case, sort of unshackling our local governments to allow them to participate in the economy that is not just coming, it's really here. So I think if we leave with that goal in mind, that is a positive step.
But it's more than that, because it's not necessarily about the Flints. It's not necessarily about the cities that are struggling right now. I mean, they're going to go out of business, right? It's the cities that are doing well right now, that if you change the revenue model, they continue to do well, and you continue to succeed, and the dip's not as severe. That's what it's all about. It's making sure that the cities like Grand Rapids, Detroit, that's starting to really move forward, that it doesn't suffer on all its basic services to the point where it can't meet them, so that you continue to grow, you continue to attract talent through a recession.
Amy?
I would just say use, when that moment comes, use the crisis to make some really big changes.
I think, just to wrap, it's not as if we really did balance anybody's budget by unbalancing city government budgets. We shifted the cost to somebody else. I mean, we see it in the high social cost that comes with communities that don't function well. The effect that has is not just about the bottom line of a city, and it's not just about whether or not we're growing, although that's obviously pretty fundamental. But it affects the lives of the people that, matter to us all. It changes the trajectory of a life of a kid growing up, not just in Flint, but in you name the town. The lack of opportunity that those kids face has a cost to all of us. It has a downstream cost, in that there might be some young person growing up in one of these communities that has incredible talent, but because they live in a place that's really depressed, that talent's never unlocked. There might be somebody walking around with some billion-dollar idea in the back of their head that could never come out if we don't figure out a way to make sure that every community is as vibrant as it could be. So there's a high social cost to all of this. The thing about this whole conversation, and this is now, I don't know, the third time we've had a panel on this subject here at this conference. I think we've done a good job to lay out the fact that, number one, cities matter. All landforms are not equal. These communities really do matter. I mean, Stephen Johnson wrote a book a few years ago called Where Good Ideas Come From, and you just trace the history of the world, and you see that where people live and work in proximity to one another, in vibrant places that are functional, great things can happen. My hometown is an example of that. Over 100 years ago, people living and working in proximity in different fields came together and did something really big that helped put the world on wheels. That was innovation. That was incredible, and it only happened because we had this functional place where people were living in proximity to one another, working in proximity to one another. So we've established that. I think what we've done also is establish that we have a broken system. It's not intentional. A lot of it was unintentional. A lot of it didn't anticipate what was going to happen and the effect of these policies, but it's pretty hard to ignore them. And now what we have, I think, is a pretty simple and I think elegant set of steps. It shouldn't be that hard to get done. So if there's a takeaway from all of this, it's that, the challenge to cities can sometimes be seen as really complicated. And there's a lot of moving parts. And there's certainly a lot of things we need to do at every level, private and public sector, to make sure that we're as competitive as we possibly can be. But sometimes, like I said at the outset, we can't see the forest for the trees. if we have communities that don't have adequate resources to make sure that the essential elements of a civil society are maintained, forget about trying to attract with any amount of capital or any amount of economic development tools or any amount of salesmanship. Forget about trying to attract capital to a place that can't provide basic essential services. That has to be the starting line. And what we have and we can do in this state really easily are implement just the few steps that are outlined in that small pamphlet on your table. Revenue sharing was in place for a reason. Revenue sharing for communities was not an act of generosity by the state of Michigan. It was not an act of largesse. It was provided because it was clear that absent that support, we weren't going to be able to be the state that we imagine ourselves to be. And the fact that we lost it takes away some of that. The truth that the tax reform in 1994 that occurred through Headley and the Proposal A work that was done was intended to protect people from being taxed out of their homes. A good policy that did not anticipate that we would see dramatic loss in property values in 1 year and those property values being restored 2 or 3 years later, but not the taxable value, not the revenue, the local revenue that those taxes support and that provide essential services. Just those two things alone could be transformational for the communities that we're talking about and give us a fighting chance. And then delivering to local governments the ability to determine their own fate by getting together with their local community members, their taxpayers, and saying, look, we have an investment that we think we need to make, and we need to be able to make a decision for ourselves to generate additional revenue. Not have a situation where revenue sharing is gone, property taxes are depressed, and local ability, local authority to offset that by hard choices that local governments make are taken away. We consign these places to this sort of path that we've now seen play out. And what's the result? We're the only state in the country with net population loss. It's not because there's something inherently wrong with us. In fact, there's something really inherently right with us. We are the most fortunate people in North America. We're surrounded by the one quality that nobody else has, the greatest source of fresh water on the planet, the most beautiful state in the Union. And we have constrained ourselves. We have locked ourselves out of so much of that incredible growth that's been going on. We need to get back in the game. And the only way we do that is to make sure that we support those communities so that they can provide essential public services, and then let the economy and let the innovation and let the ingenuity of business take it from there. We have to provide those basic functioning services, and we're not doing that now. And that's really the goal of this conversation. So thank you all. Thank you all for being here.